I signed the report because it was my job, and because saying no would have cost me my career. It was just another Tuesday morning, coffee gone cold, fluorescent lights buzzing above my desk. The file number didn't mean anything to me at first. Neither did the address. One page was missing its staple. I noticed it, then moved on. By lunchtime, someone thanked me for handling it quietly. That was when I realized everything I trusted about my work and myself was about to collapse. I've always believed that if you do your job right, the rest of your life tends to stay upright. Not perfect, not happy all the time, just upright, like a chair with 4 legs that doesn't wobble when you sit down. I'm 51 years old, and for the last 14 years I've worked as a municipal compliance inspector for the city of Reno, Nevada. Most people hear that title and imagine clipboards, hard hats, maybe an orange vest. That's not wrong. What they don't imagine is how invisible the job is. When I do my work well, nothing happens. No news stories, no lawsuits, no fires, no phone calls in the middle of the night. That invisibility suited me. My mornings followed the same pattern. Wake up at 5:40 a.m. without an alarm. Coffee grounds measured by habit, not a scoop. 2 slices of wheat toast, one with peanut butter, one plain. The local news on mute while I checked emails on my phone. By 6:30, I was in my truck, heading east as the sun came up over the low brown hills, the sky doing that pale Nevada thing where it looks clean even when it isn't. My neighborhood sat just far enough from downtown to feel quiet, but close enough that property values still mattered. Stucco houses, gravel yards, a few stubborn lawns, retired couples, young families, people who waved if they recognized you and didn't if they didn't. I'd lived there 12 years, long enough that the cracks in the sidewalk felt familiar. At work, I shared a floor with 6 other inspectors. We all did different things: fire safety, environmental impact, zoning, but we understood each other. We were the last line between paperwork and reality, between a signature and a consequence. Most days, my job was simple: review inspection reports, verify documentation, approve or flag compliance filings submitted by contractors, property managers, or third-party inspectors. If something was off, I sent it back. If it checked out, I signed and moved on. People liked to believe the system was complicated. In truth, it ran on repetition. Same forms, same codes, same mistakes. Once you'd seen 1,000 of them, the 1,001st felt familiar. That familiarity made me efficient. It also made me confident. I'd been divorced for 6 years. No kids. My ex-wife lived in Oregon now with a man who sold outdoor equipment and always looked sunburned in his photos. We talked twice a year, usually about paperwork. There was no bitterness left, just distance. My parents were gone. My younger sister lived in Phoenix with 3 kids and a busy life. We texted. Holidays rotated. It worked. On paper, I had nothing to lose and nothing to prove. That was the version of my life I trusted. The Tuesday everything began looked exactly like the Tuesday before it. I parked in the same spot on the 3rd level of the garage, walked past the same faded mural near the elevators, nodded at Marlene from Records, who always smelled faintly like hand sanitizer and peppermint. By 8:12 I was at my desk. The overhead lights hummed. My chair squeaked when I leaned back. I lined up the folders on my desk the way I always did, approved on the left, pending on the right, returns stacked neatly in the middle. The first file I opened belonged to a multi-unit residential property on the north side of town. Older complex, low-income housing, nothing unusual. I scanned the cover sheet, checked the inspection date, matched the inspector ID with our system. Everything looked fine. I initialed the corner and slid it into the approved pile. The second file was commercial. The third was a duplex renovation. By mid-morning, I'd cleared 9 reports. My coffee had gone cold without me noticing. That was when I opened the 10th file. It wasn't marked urgent. No red flag, no sticky note. Just a standard manila folder with a printed barcode and a typed address. I recognized the street name but couldn't place it. That wasn't unusual. Reno sprawls wider than people think. I flipped through the pages. Electrical compliance, fire egress, structural notes. Everything checked out. One page paused me for half a second. The staple was missing. Not torn, not bent, just gone. The papers were aligned, as if it had never been there. I noticed it, registered it, and kept going. That's important to say out loud now, because later I would replay that moment in my head more times than I could count, wondering why it didn't stop me. But at the time, it didn't feel like anything. Staples fall out, pages get reassembled. Offices are messy places pretending to be orderly. I signed the report. At 11:47 a.m., my supervisor forwarded a calendar invite for a meeting the following week. Budget review. Mandatory attendance. I accepted without thinking. At noon, I ate lunch at my desk. Turkey sandwich. No mustard. I scrolled through my phone, reading headlines I wouldn't remember later. Attol. Ota oktradivipe. My desk phone rang. That alone was unusual. Most communication came through email. Calls meant someone wanted an answer now. I picked up, gave my name. The voice on the other end hesitated. Male. Mid-30s, maybe. He said my title out loud, like he was checking it against a list. I was told you handled the clearance on the North Carson property, he said. I pulled the file back out of the approved stack, checked the address. Yes, I said. It was in compliance. There was a pause. A breath, not relief, something else. Okay, he said. Thank you for taking care of it. The phrasing struck me as slightly off. Not reviewing, not approving, taking care of it. Before I could ask anything, the line went dead. I stared at the receiver for a moment, then placed it back on the cradle. I told myself it was nothing. At 1:15, Marlene stopped by my desk to drop off a revised form. At 2, I returned 2 files for minor corrections. At 3:30, I stood by the window and stretched my back, watching traffic inch along Virginia Street. The day ended on time. In the parking garage, a man I didn't recognize held the door open for me. He wore a navy jacket despite the heat. He nodded once, polite, unreadable. Appreciate it, I said. He smiled, just barely. On the drive home, I stopped at the grocery store. Bought eggs, chicken breasts, and a bag of rice. The cashier asked if I wanted a receipt. I said no. That night, I grilled the chicken on my back patio. Ate standing up, fork in one hand, phone in the other. The sky went dark. A neighbor's dog barked. Somewhere, a car alarm chirped and then stopped. I slept well. The next morning, when I walked into my office, there was an email waiting for me. No subject line, no signature. Just one sentence. Thank you for handling it quietly. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Then I did what I had always done. I closed the email. I told myself that if you do your job right, nothing happens. I didn't yet understand how wrong that belief was, and I had no idea how much it was about to cost me. The thing about systems is that they teach you what to ignore. You don't realize it's happening at first. You tell yourself you're learning efficiency, sharpening judgment, separating noise from signal. But over time, the line between irrelevant and inconvenient gets thinner, and eventually you stop noticing which side you're on. I went about my Wednesday the same way I always did. The email from the night before stayed closed in my inbox. I didn't delete it, but I didn't forward it either. I told myself I'd deal with it later, which in my line of work usually meant never. By 9 a.m., the floor was buzzing in that low, bureaucratic way that sounds like productivity but mostly isn't. Printers whirring, phones ringing once, then stopping, someone laughing too loudly in the break room. I opened my task list and started at the top. 2 residential re-inspections, 1 commercial variance request, a follow-up audit from the state fire marshal's office that had been bouncing around departments for weeks. Nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. Halfway through the morning, I noticed something else that didn't quite register at first. The approved stack on my desk was thinner than usual. That might sound insignificant, but when you do the same job long enough, you develop a sense of weight, a physical awareness of how much paper should be where at any given time. It's like knowing when your wallet is missing before you check your pocket. I counted. The numbers didn't match my log from the day before. 1 file was gone. I didn't panic. Files move. Admin pulls them. Supervisors review them. Sometimes they get misrouted. There were a dozen reasonable explanations, and panic wasn't part of any of them. Still, I opened the digital tracking system and typed in the case number from memory. The system showed the file as closed, approved, archived. No flags. I frowned at the screen. Archived meant it shouldn't have moved yet. Physical files usually sat for at least 48 hours before records took them downstairs. That buffer existed for a reason. Corrections, second looks, accidental approvals. It was a quiet safeguard no one talked about. I checked the timestamp. The file had been archived at 6:12 p.m. I hadn't been in the building at 6:12 p.m. That was the first moment something cold touched the back of my neck. I told myself there was probably an explanation. Overtime, remote access, a clerical adjustment logged late. The system wasn't perfect. Still, I stood up and walked down to records. Marlene wasn't at her desk. A younger guy named Evan sat in her place, tapping at a keyboard and chewing gum with his mouth open. "Hey," I said. "Quick question." He looked up. "Sure. Did you pull any files from my approved stack last night?" He shook his head immediately. "Nope. I clocked out at 4. 1. Anyone else?" He shrugged. "Records doesn't handle inspector stacks until the next day. You know that." I did. I thanked him and went back upstairs. At my desk, I sat down slowly and stared at the empty space where the folder should have been. It bothered me more than it should have. Not because something was wrong. Not yet. But because it meant someone had touched my work without saying so. In an office built on procedure, that was a small violation of trust. I pulled up the archived digital file and scrolled through it carefully this time. Everything was exactly as I remembered it. Same notes, same approvals, same missing staple, which of course didn't exist in digital form. I checked the metadata. Last edited by System Admin. That label appeared occasionally when files were moved between departments or adjusted for formatting. It wasn't supposed to be personal. It was meant to be neutral. But neutrality is just a mask when you don't know who's underneath it. I took a screenshot and saved it to my desktop, telling myself it was just for my own reference. A habit I'd picked up years ago after a messy appeal where no one remembered who'd changed what. The rest of the day passed without incident. No calls, no emails, no follow-ups. I left work on time again. At home, I cooked rice and chicken, portioned leftovers into containers, and watched a documentary I'd already seen. Around 10, my phone buzzed with a text from my sister, a photo of her youngest holding a soccer trophy, all teeth and dirt. I smiled, typed back a thumbs up, and went to bed. Thursday morning, the missing file crossed my mind only once, while brushing my teeth. I remember because I paused mid-motion, toothpaste dripping into the sink, thinking, I should ask about that. Then I rinsed and forgot again. At work, the floor felt different, not in a dramatic way. No hushed conversations, no suspicious looks. Just a subtle shift, like walking into a room where the furniture had been rearranged overnight. I caught my supervisor, Dan, by the copier. "Hey," I said. "Quick thing. One of my approved files got archived earlier than usual yesterday." He nodded without looking up. "Which one?" I gave him the address. "Oh," he said. "Yeah, that one." That was it. Just that one. "What about it?" I asked. Dan finally looked at me. His expression was neutral, practiced. "It got fast-tracked. Don't worry about it." Fast-tracked how? By whom? For what reason? None of those questions left my mouth. Dan clapped the copier lid shut and smiled like the conversation was over. "You did good work on it. Saved us some time." He walked away. I stood there longer than necessary, listening to the copier hum. Back at my desk, I tried to focus. I really did. I opened new files, made notes, sent emails, but my attention kept sliding back to the archived case, like a tongue worrying a sore tooth. Around noon, I decided to pull the inspection photos attached to the digital file. I hadn't looked at them closely before. They were standard grainy shots of wiring panels, stairwells, emergency exits, the kind of photos you learn to skim because 90% of them show nothing. I clicked through slowly this time. Image 12 stopped me. It was a photo of a hallway, beige walls, fluorescent lights, a red exit sign glowing at the far end. What caught my eye wasn't the hallway. It was the reflection. In the glass of a fire extinguisher case, I could see a figure standing behind the camera. The inspector. I zoomed in. The badge clipped to his belt was partially visible. Not the name, just the logo. It wasn't ours. I checked the inspector ID again. The file listed a certified third-party contractor, someone we'd worked with before. Nothing unusual. Still, I opened the contractor database and searched the name. Active, licensed, no complaints. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a flicker of irritation at myself. This was what overthinking looked like, seeing ghosts in reflections, connecting dots that didn't belong together. I closed the photo and minimized the file. At 12:43 p.m., my desk phone rang again. Same number as Tuesday. I answered. "This is him," the voice said immediately. Same man, same tone. "I just wanted to confirm we're clear." I swallowed. Clear on what? There was a pause. A short one. Controlled. "The occupancy," he said. "There won't be any issues." I glanced at the computer screen, at the archived file minimized at the bottom. "No," I said slowly. "The report shows compliance." "Good," he said. "That helps." The call ended. I didn't move for a full minute after that. Not because I was scared. Not yet. Because for the first time, the thought formed clearly in my mind. This isn't about paperwork. Whatever this was, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a clerical error or a misunderstood procedure. Someone was using my approval to smooth something over. Something time-sensitive. Something they didn't want attention on. I looked around the office. People typed, laughed, walked past my desk without a glance. No one else seemed aware that anything was wrong. That was the most unsettling part. I opened the archived file again and stared at the address. North Carson. I typed it into Google Maps. The street view loaded slowly. When the image finally resolved, my stomach tightened. The building wasn't an apartment complex. It was a converted warehouse. And according to the zoning overlay, it shouldn't have been residential at all. I sat back in my chair, the office noise fading into a dull roar. The detail I'd ignored, the missing staple, the early archive, the neutral system admin, edit, suddenly felt heavier. Not dramatic, not explosive, just wrong. And wrong, in my line of work, was never small. I didn't know who the file was really for. I didn't know why it needed to be handled quietly. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever was happening, I was already part of it. Whether I liked it or not, I didn't drive past North Carson Street that day. I want to be clear about that. Because later, when everything unraveled, people assumed I must have gone looking for trouble. That curiosity got the better of me. That I stepped outside my lane. I didn't. I went home at 5, same as always. Cooked dinner, watched half an episode of a show I wasn't really following. Went to bed before 11. If anything, I was trying to convince myself that the discomfort I felt was just that discomfort. The kind that comes from noticing something off and not having a clean explanation for it yet. Friday morning, I woke up with the address still in my head. North Carson. I didn't say it out loud. I didn't write it down. I just carried it with me like a loose thread I kept feeling but refusing to pull. At work, my inbox was full in the way it always was on Fridays. Requests stacked up, people rushing to close things out before the weekend. Contractors suddenly polite, property managers suddenly anxious. At 9:17 a.m., an email came in marked external. No subject line again. This time, it had an attachment. A PDF, 3 pages. I hovered over it longer than I should have, then opened it. The first page was a notice of inspection failure. Not mine. A different department. County level. Dated 6 months earlier. The address was the same. North Carson. I scrolled. Page 2 listed violations. Fire exits obstructed. Electrical load exceeded limits. Temporary partitions installed without permits. The language was blunt, procedural, indifferent. Page 3 stopped me cold. It was a follow-up note, stamped unresolved. The inspector's comment was short. Occupancy appears higher than reported. Possible overnight use. Recommend further review before approval of any compliance-related filings. I checked the sender's email address. It wasn't a city account. It was a personal Gmail. Before I could think too hard about that, my desk phone rang. Different number this time. I answered. "Hi," a woman said. She sounded tired. Not rushed, just worn. "I'm trying to reach someone about an inspection approval for 1442 North Carson." My fingers tightened around the phone. "This is compliance," I said carefully. "What's your concern?" There was a pause, then a small, humorless laugh. "I'm not sure where to start. Thanks for watching." I swiveled my chair slightly, lowering my voice even though no one was close. "Why don't you try?" She took a breath. I could hear traffic behind her, a crosswalk signal chirping faintly. "My name is Rachel," she said. "I work with a non-profit outreach group. We help families find temporary housing, shelters, transitional spaces, stuff like that." I didn't respond. "We placed 6 families at that address," she continued. "We were told it was cleared, safe, compliant." My mouth went dry. "When?" I asked. "Last week," she said. 3 nights ago, actually." The room seemed to tilt slightly, like an elevator starting to move before you expect it. "And?" I said. "And the fire marshal shut it down last night," she said. "Middle of the night. Families were told to leave immediately." I closed my eyes for a moment. "Why are you calling me?" I asked. "Because when we asked who approved the occupancy, your name came up." The sentence landed with a weight that surprised me. "I don't approve placements," I said automatically. "I review compliance filings." "I know," she said. "That's what everyone keeps saying." I could hear frustration creeping into her voice now. Not anger, something closer to disbelief. "They're saying everything was technically in order," she continued. "That the paperwork was clean. That the city signed off." I glanced at my screen, at the archived file minimized at the bottom. "And it was," I said. "That's what scares me," she replied. Silence stretched between us. I thought about the photo, the reflection, the badge that didn't match. "What happened to the families?" I asked. "They were scattered," Rachel said. 2 went back to shelters. 1 slept in a car. 1, I don't know yet. I rubbed my forehead with my free hand. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "I really am. But if the report shows compliance, then the system worked." She finished for me. "Right?" I didn't answer. "I'm not calling to accuse you," she said quickly. I needed to talk to someone who might actually listen." "Why?" I asked. Another pause. "Because the property manager told me to stop asking questions," she said. "He said if I kept pushing, our organization would lose future placement opportunities." That did it. That was the moment the situation stopped being abstract. "This isn't about you," she said quietly. "I know that, but you're the only name I can trace. Everyone else is hiding behind procedure." I stared at the gray fabric of my cubicle wall. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "I just wanted you to know what your approval unlocked." After we hung up, I sat completely still, not shocked, not panicked, just very aware of my own breathing. I replayed the conversation in my head, listening for accusation, for blame. There wasn't any. That somehow made it worse. I opened the archived file again and pulled up the approval timestamp. 6:12 p.m. The same night, the families were placed. The same night, someone needed that building cleared. I checked the county inspection date again, 6 months earlier. Unresolved. My approval hadn't erased those violations. It had stepped around them. At 10:34 a.m., I walked into Dan's office. He looked up from his screen, eyebrows lifting slightly. "What's up?" I closed the door behind me. "Who asked you to fast-track North Carson?" I asked. His expression didn't change much, but something in his posture did. A subtle tightening. "That was handled above us," he said. "By who?" Dan sighed. "Look, you did your job. That's all you need to know." "No," I said. "It isn't." He leaned back in his chair. "You want to make this complicated? I want to understand why my name is attached to families getting kicked out in the middle of the night," I said. Dan's jaw tightened. "You don't want to be the guy who asks that question," he said. The words were calm, measured, but they landed like a warning. "I already am," I replied. He studied me for a long moment, then looked away. There are development interests involved, he said finally. Temporary arrangements, legal gray areas. People were sleeping there, I said, with kids. I didn't say it was pretty, he said. I said it was legal. I thought of the unresolved inspection note, the missing staple, the early archive. It wasn't legal, I said. It was convenient. Dan stood up. Drop it, he said. This isn't a hill you want. I left his office without another word. At my desk, I stared at my hands. I hadn't gone looking for trouble. Trouble had followed the paper. It had followed my signature. And now it had names, faces, families. The worst part wasn't that I'd been used. It was that I had done exactly what the system trained me to do. I had moved on, and in doing so, I had helped something wrong slide smoothly into place. By the end of the day, I understood one thing clearly. This wasn't an error I could correct with a form, and it wasn't something I could unknow, whether I acted or not. The moment I took that call, I was no longer an observer. I was in it, fully. I didn't tell anyone about the call with Rachel. Not that day. Not the next. I carried it with me instead. The way you carry something sharp in your pocket, careful how you move, careful who you brush up against, always aware it's there. Friday afternoon blurred by. I answered emails, returned 2 files, sat through a meeting about budget allocations that felt obscene in its normalcy. People complained about printer toner. Someone joked about happy hour. At 4:58, I shut down my computer and left. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every red light stretched, every billboard seemed louder. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the truck with the engine off, hands still on the wheel, staring at my front door like it belonged to someone else. Inside, the house smelled faintly like last night's rice. I didn't bother cooking. I poured a glass of water and stood at the counter, letting the silence settle. That night, I opened my laptop at home for the first time in months. I logged into the city portal using my credentials. Technically allowed. Not encouraged, but allowed. Inspectors did after-hours reviews all the time, especially during peak seasons. I didn't search for North Carson right away. I searched by date. I pulled every compliance approval issued in the last 6 months that had been fast-tracked, anything archived outside normal hours, anything marked expedited, anything touched by system admin. The list was longer than I expected. Not dozens, but more than one. 7 addresses, all different parts of the city, different zoning categories, different inspectors attached to them. At first glance, there was no obvious connection, but as I opened each file, patterns began to surface. Subtle ones, the kind you don't notice unless you're looking for them. Temporary occupancy permits issued shortly before closures. Third-party inspections clearing violations that had previously been unresolved. Files archived quickly, quietly, with minimal internal notes. And always, somewhere in the chain, a signature, a name, not always mine. That's when something in my chest loosened and tightened at the same time. Relief, because this wasn't just me. Dread, because it wasn't just me. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes, staring at the ceiling. This wasn't a mistake. And it wasn't a single favor called in for a single property. It was a process. Saturday morning, I drove to a diner on the edge of town. The kind of place with laminated menus and coffee that tasted like it had been brewed hours ago and kept hot out of stubbornness. I sat in a booth by the window and ordered eggs I barely touched. I wasn't sure why I was there. Maybe I needed to be around people. Maybe I needed to feel normal for a few minutes. Halfway through my coffee, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. "Hello? Is this Mark?" a man asked. "Yes. This is Luis Alvarez. I work inspections for Washoe County." My grip tightened. "Okay. I got your number from someone in records," he said quickly. "Hope that's all right." "It's fine," I said, though it wasn't. "I'm calling because I think we crossed paths on a file," he continued. North Carson. The clink of dishes and low hum of conversation around me faded. "What about it?" I asked. Luis hesitated. "I failed that site 6 months ago. I closed my eyes. I wrote it up properly," he said. "Sent it through channels. Never heard back. Then last week, I saw it listed as compliant. You weren't notified?" I asked. No, he said. And that's not how it works. If a failed site clears, the original inspector gets looped in. Always. I was so. I stared at the half-eaten eggs in front of me. I thought maybe I'd made a mistake, he continued. But I pulled my notes. The violations were real. Nothing about that building changed enough to justify approval. Then why didn't you push it? I asked. There it was. The question I'd been circling without naming. Luis exhaled slowly. Because I was told to let it go. By who? He didn't answer immediately. Someone higher up, he said finally. Someone who doesn't sign reports. The waitress stopped by and refilled my coffee without asking. I nodded my thanks automatically. You calling me because you want help? I asked. No, Luis said. I'm calling because I want to know if I'm the only one. I swallowed. You're not. There was a pause. Then a quiet, humorless laugh. Yeah, I figured. We talked for 10 more minutes. About procedures, about pressure, about the unspoken understanding that some files moved faster than others for reasons no one wrote down. Luis never accused anyone by name. He didn't have to. After we hung up, I sat there long after the check had been paid, watching cars pass by on the road outside. By Sunday afternoon, I had 3 names. Not conspirators. Participants. People whose signatures appeared on expedited files. People who, like me, had followed the process as it was presented to them. One of them was a woman named Carol who worked zoning. Another was a junior fire inspector 2 years out of training. The third was a consultant who bounced between departments. None of them benefited directly. No promotions, no bonuses, just smoother days, fewer questions, less friction. I drafted an email to Carol 3 times before sending it. It was simple, neutral. Hey, quick question about a past approval. Mind if I ask how it was routed? She responded an hour later. Can we talk tomorrow? Not on email. Monday morning, we met in the break room before most people arrived. Carol looked tired. Her hair was pulled back too tight, like she hadn't slept well. I didn't want to be involved, she said without preamble. I swear to God. Involved in what? I asked. She gave me a look. You know, I waited. They told me it was temporary, she continued. Emergency use. Short-term occupancy. They said the paperwork would catch up later. And you believed them? I asked. She flinched slightly. I wanted to. I nodded. I understood that more than I liked. They didn't threaten me, she said quickly. Nothing like that. It was just implied. That pushing back would make things harder. That I'd get labeled difficult. The word hung between us. Difficult. The quiet death of so many objections. Who are they? I asked. Carol shook her head. I don't know. Not really. I never met them. It was always through someone else. A buffer. Always a buffer. That afternoon, I sat at my desk and watched the office move around me. Phones rang. Chairs scraped. People argued about lunch orders. I realized something then that settled deep in my gut. This wasn't a story with villains and victims neatly arranged. This was a web of small decisions made by ordinary people trying not to be the one who slowed things down. Trying not to be the one who asked too many questions. I thought back to the missing staple, the early archive, the email thanking me for handling it quietly. Those weren't anomalies. They were signals, not of a secret cabal, but of a system that had learned how to reward silence. By the end of the day, I had a list, not of crimes, not of proof, of people. People who, like me, had touched the same invisible current without realizing where it flowed. That was when the weight of it truly settled. This wasn't about one bad building. It wasn't about one wrong approval. It was about how many of us had been nudged, just slightly, out of alignment, and how easily we'd stayed there. And for the first time since this began, I understood something that frightened me more than any threat ever could. If I stepped forward, I wouldn't just be pointing at someone else. I'd be pointing at all of us, including myself. I didn't sleep much after that. Not because I was afraid of what might happen, but because my mind wouldn't stop organizing the problem, lining things up, comparing shapes, looking for the place where coincidence ends and intent begins. That instinct came from my job, from years of being trained to treat confusion as something temporary, something that goes away if you look long enough. By Tuesday morning, I knew I couldn't keep this in my head anymore. I needed something solid, something that didn't rely on conversations, impressions, or the unreliable memories of people who wanted to believe they hadn't done anything wrong. I needed proof, not the kind that gets whispered in hallways, the kind that survives daylight. I started with what I knew best: records. At 7:12 a.m., before most of the office arrived, I logged into the compliance database and pulled a raw export. No filters, no summaries, just timestamps, user IDs, and action logs for every expedited file in the last year. It took the system a full 3 minutes to generate the report. When it finally loaded, my screen filled with rows of data that meant nothing to anyone else. To me, they meant everything. Each line told a small story. Who opened a file? Who edited it? Who archived it? When? From where? Patterns emerged quickly. Most files followed the same rhythm: opened during business hours, edited once or twice, archived the next day by records. Predictable, boring. The expedited files didn't. They clustered around certain times: late afternoons, early evenings, moments when offices emptied out and questions stopped being asked. And always there was a touch point from the same internal user group, not a person. A role: operations coordination. That role wasn't supposed to interact with compliance approvals directly. Operations coordinated scheduling, interdepartmental communication, logistics. They greased wheels. They didn't sign off on safety. Yet there it was. I pulled up the internal org chart. Operations coordination had 3 full-time employees. One name stood out immediately. I didn't know why at first. Just a faint recognition, like a face you've seen in passing but never spoken to. Then it clicked. She was the woman who'd smiled at me in the elevator the morning after North Carson was archived. I hadn't thought about that smile until now. I clicked her name. Tenure: 8 years. No disciplinary actions. Solid performance reviews. Described repeatedly as efficient, responsive, and discreet. Discreet. I stared at the word longer than necessary. I exported her activity log separately. The overlap was undeniable. She didn't approve files. She didn't alter content. She moved them, redirected them, marked them ready, cleared pathways. She was the hand that never left fingerprints. Still, this wasn't proof of wrongdoing. Not legally. Not even ethically. On paper. She could argue and win that she was just doing her job, responding to requests, facilitating workflow. So I kept going. I cross-referenced the expedited approvals with city permit data, then zoning appeals, then fire marshal shutdowns. A new pattern surfaced. Every expedited compliance approval was followed within days or weeks by a closure, a condemnation, or a forced vacancy, sometimes framed as safety enforcement, sometimes as zoning correction. Always sudden, always disruptive. Temporary compliance, permanent displacement. I leaned back in my chair, heart thudding slowly. This wasn't incompetence. It was timing. I printed the spreadsheet and laid the pages out on my desk, covering it edge to edge. Dates, addresses, departments, outcomes. The story told itself, quietly. Certain properties needed to appear compliant just long enough for something else to happen. Long enough to move people in. Long enough to move people out. Long enough to avoid scrutiny during a transition. Then the hammer fell. I took photos of the pages with my phone and saved them to a folder labeled Personal. That label felt strange, like a lie. At noon, I went for a walk instead of eating lunch. The sun was sharp, the air dry. I circled the block twice, letting the heat burn off the fog in my head. This was more than suspicion now, but it still wasn't enough. Because every step of this process had plausible deniability built in. Layers of it. If I presented this to anyone as is, it would be explained away as coincidence, as the messy overlap of departments doing their jobs. No one would call it corruption. They'd call it unfortunate. And unfortunate things don't get fixed. They get absorbed. That afternoon, I made a decision I'd never made before. I pulled the building permit history for North Carson going back 5 years. Not just the approvals, the ownership records. It took longer than expected. Properties like that tend to change hands through shell entities, LLCs registered out of state, paper curtains designed to hide the real owners. Eventually, a name surfaced repeatedly, not an individual. A development group. I recognized it instantly. They were everywhere in Reno. New mixed-use projects, luxury condos, commercial redevelopments pitched as revitalization. They had money, they had lawyers, they had influence, and according to the records, they had acquired the North Carson property 2 weeks after the families were removed. 2 weeks. I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling something cold and steady settle into place. The compliance approval hadn't been about safety. It had been about timing the eviction. At 4:46 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. They moved the families again. Different sites. Short notice. No explanation. I typed back slowly. Do you know who owns North Carson now? 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. No, she wrote. Why? I didn't answer. Because I wasn't ready to say it yet. Saying it would make it real. I stayed late that night. Not to work. To watch. The office after hours had a different feel. Less noise, less distraction. Just the soft glow of monitors and the distant hum of HVAC systems. At 6:05 p.m., the operations coordination user logged in. I watched the activity feed refresh in real time. Files opened, touched, moved. Efficient, clean, quiet. At 6:17 p.m., a compliance file from a different district was marked ready for expedited review. I pulled it up. Different address, same structure, same kind of temporary occupancy. I felt my pulse quicken. This was happening again. Right now, I didn't intervene. I didn't flag it. I didn't alert anyone. I watched. The file moved exactly as North Carson had. Same sequence, same timestamps, same invisible hand. At 6:41 p.m., it was archived. Approved. I sat back in my chair and exhaled slowly. This was proof, but it was also something else. It was evidence that if I stepped in now clumsily, emotionally, without strategy, I'd just become another name in the log. Another person who raised concerns and got managed. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, and I finally understood the trap. If I reported this through normal channels, it would be buried, sanitized, explained. If I went public too soon, I'd be discredited. Framed as a disgruntled employee misreading data. The proof I had showed a pattern, but it didn't show intent. And intent was the line. I packed up my things and left the office just after 7. In the parking garage, the air was warm and stale. My footsteps echoed. I paused beside my truck and looked back at the building. All those floors, all those offices, all those people doing small, reasonable things that added up to something deeply wrong. The first proof I'd found was real. It was also fragile. And I knew, with a certainty that made my stomach knot, that if I wanted this to matter, to actually protect anyone, I couldn't move yet. Not until I understood exactly who benefited and how far they were willing to go to keep it quiet. Once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel dramatic. It settles into your bones quietly, like a diagnosis you already suspected before the doctor said it out loud. I stopped thinking about North Carson as a place. I started thinking about it as a template. Every spare moment that week, I ran comparisons. Not obsessively, methodically. The way I'd been trained. The way my job required. I wasn't looking for villains anymore. I was looking for repetition. I took the 7 addresses I'd identified and built timelines for each one. Not narratives, just facts. Dates, departments, approvals, closures, transfers of ownership. I printed them and taped them to the wall of my home office, arranging them side by side. From a distance, they looked unrelated. Up close, they were identical. The same sequence played out again and again. A property with unresolved violations. A third-party inspection clearing it without fully addressing the issues. A compliance approval pushed through late in the day. Temporary occupancy. Sudden enforcement. Displacement. Transfer. The speed varied. The language changed. The outcome never did. I stopped asking who did this. I asked what allowed this to happen. The answer wasn't corruption in the movie sense. No envelopes, no secret meetings, no one whispering in dark corners. It was alignment. Departments doing exactly what they were incentivized to do, just not at the same time, not with the same information, and never with responsibility for the whole. Compliance checked boxes. Operations moved files. Enforcement acted on complaints. Development capitalized on opportunity. No single action violated policy. Together, they violated people. That realization was worse than discovering a villain, because villains can be removed. Systems adapt. I went back to the inspection photos again, not for North Carson, but for the other properties. This time, I focused on what wasn't there. No kids' toys, no furniture marks, no personal items visible, nothing to indicate permanence. Temporary spaces, designed to look empty when no one was supposed to be there. I compared them to shelter intake logs Rachel had shared after some careful conversations. Names redacted, dates intact. The match rate was chilling. These weren't random placements, they were pressure valves. I sat at my desk late one night, staring at the wall of timelines, and laughed once. Quietly, without humor. The system didn't care who lived there. It just needed bodies to justify use. Occupancy to justify compliance. Compliance to justify delay. Delay to justify acquisition. Once the transaction closed, safety mattered again. That was the cycle. I thought about Dan, about Carol, about Luis. None of them were architects of this. They were gears, and gears don't feel the machine. Friday morning, I ran into Dan in the hallway. He looked tired. More tired than usual. "Everything okay?" he asked casually. I nodded. "Yeah, just busy." He studied me for a second. "You sure? Why wouldn't I be?" He hesitated, then smiled. "Good. We need you focused." Need, not want. I watched him walk away, wondering how long he'd known. Or if he knew it all. That afternoon, I made a list. Not of suspects. Of choke points. Places where the pattern could be interrupted. Compliance approvals. Third-party inspections. Operations routing. Enforcement timing. Every one of them had rules, policies, oversight mechanisms, and every one of them relied on trust to function efficiently. Trust was the vulnerability. I tested it carefully. On Monday, I flagged a new file for secondary review. Nothing dramatic, just a routine request for additional documentation. The kind no one objected to publicly. The response came within an hour. From Operations Coordination. "This one needs to move quickly. Can you clear it today?" No explanation. No justification. Just urgency. I stared at the message, feeling my pulse slow. There it was. The assumption that I would comply. That I would be quiet. I replied neutrally. Waiting on additional documentation. The response was immediate. "Let me know what's needed." I asked for something small but inconvenient. An updated electrical load calculation. Nothing unreasonable. Just enough to slow things down. It took 3 days to arrive. During that time, the file didn't move. No late-night archive. No quiet acceleration. When the documentation came in, I reviewed it carefully. It didn't pass. I returned it. 2 hours later, Dan called me into his office. "This one's becoming a problem," he said, tapping the folder on his desk. "Because?" I asked. "Because it's holding things up." "Things like what?" He sighed. "You know what I mean." "No," I said. "I don't." Silence stretched. "This isn't your call alone," he said finally. "It is if it's non-compliant." He looked at me for a long moment. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I thought of the families sleeping in cars. "I'm making it slower," I said. "That's different." I left his office, knowing something had shifted. The system had noticed resistance. That evening, I received a calendar invite. Mandatory meeting. Human resources. No description, just a time. I didn't panic. Panic clouds judgment. Instead, I documented everything. Screenshots, logs, emails, messages. I backed them up twice. Then I did something I'd avoided until now. I called Rachel. We spoke carefully. Not about accusations, about logistics, about what she'd seen. She confirmed what I already suspected. The placements were coordinated, suggested, encouraged, not forced, which meant no one could be blamed directly. They always say it's temporary, she said. Just a few nights. Just until things settle. And then? I asked. And then the building fails inspection, she said. And the families are the problem. I closed my eyes. I don't think they expect anyone to connect the dots, she continued. And if someone does, they don't expect them to care enough to risk anything. That was the heart of it. Risk. Not moral outrage. Not anger. Risk. What would it cost to stop this? Time. Reputation. Career. Silence was cheaper. By Wednesday, the HR meeting had come and gone. It was polite, vague, focused on workplace alignment and communication expectations. No accusations, just a reminder of where the lines were. I thanked them and went back to my desk. The pattern was now undeniable. The system didn't need villains. It needed compliance. And I was standing in the middle of it, holding proof that was accurate, detailed, and still not enough. Because proof alone doesn't change systems. Pressure does. And pressure always flows toward the weakest point. The question wasn't whether this was wrong. That was clear. The question was whether I was willing to become that point. Because once you stop being a gear, the machine doesn't thank you. It grinds you down until you fit again, or breaks. I kept waiting for a face, a name I could circle in red, a voice I could point to and say, "That's it. That's where this turns ugly." That's how stories usually work. Someone crosses a line, someone else pays the price. You draw the boundary, choose a side, and move forward. But the longer I stayed inside this, the more I realized the person I was most tempted to blame wasn't a villain at all. It was someone close, familiar, reasonable, and that made it harder. Her name was Carol. We'd crossed paths for years without really knowing each other. Same floor, same badge color, different department, zoning, not compliance. Close enough to overlap, far enough to avoid accountability for each other's decisions. After our conversation in the break room, I couldn't stop thinking about her face when she said, I wanted to believe them. Not guilty, not defensive, tired. The following Thursday, she stopped by my desk just after lunch. She didn't sit, didn't even lean. I heard you flagged the Silver Ridge file, she said. I looked up from my screen. Yes, her jaw tightened slightly. That one's sensitive. So was North Carson, I said. A flicker crossed her eyes. Not fear, recognition. Can we talk? She asked. We went outside, down the stairs, into the narrow courtyard behind the building where no one ever lingered. The air smelled like hot concrete and exhaust. Carol folded her arms, then unfolded them. You're digging in a direction that doesn't end well. For who? I asked. She didn't answer right away. For people who don't have leverage, she said finally. I watched a pigeon hop along the edge of the planter. You knew North Carson would fail eventually, I said. She exhaled through her nose. I knew it wouldn't last. That's not the same thing. It is when you've been here long enough, she said. Everything is temporary. The only difference is who gets displaced first. 8. The bluntness surprised me. Why didn't you stop it? I asked. She looked at me then. Really looked. Why didn't you? The question hit harder than I expected. Because I didn't know, I said. And now you do, she replied. What do you think changes? I thought about that. About the emails, the logs, the patterns. I think silence stops being neutral, I said. Carol smiled faintly. That's a nice idea. Is it wrong? I asked. She hesitated. No, but it's expensive. Thanks for watching. We stood there, the hum of traffic filling the space between us. They didn't threaten me, she said suddenly. I want you to understand that. I do. They didn't bribe me, either. No money, no promises. I believe you. They just framed it, she continued, as inevitability, as efficiency, as something bigger than any one file. I nodded, and after a while, she said, you stop asking if it's right. You ask if resisting is worth it. There it was, the real fracture. Was it? I asked. Carol looked away. I don't know anymore. We went back inside without saying anything else. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, and the lights off, scrolling through the data again, not to find something new, but to see it with different eyes. I wasn't looking for proof of malice. I was looking for proof of indifference, and it was everywhere, not in any single decision, but in the gaps between them. In the way responsibility thinned out as it moved from one department to another. In the way urgency overrode care, and care was framed as inefficiency. I thought about Luis, about how he'd failed the site and been told to let it go. I thought about Dan, about how he'd said, "You don't want to be the guy who asks that question." I thought about Carol, standing in the courtyard, warning me not out of cruelty, but experience. None of them wanted harm. They just didn't want friction. Friday morning, I received another message from Operations Coordination. Different file, same language. This one needs to move. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I walked down to the zoning floor. Carol was at her desk, reviewing a map on her screen. She glanced up as I approached. "I'm not here to accuse you," I said quietly. She closed the map. "Good. I'm here to understand something," I continued. "If I slow this down, really slow it down, what happens?" She leaned back in her chair. "They route around you." "How?" "Different inspector, different department, external pressure." "And you?" I asked. She studied me carefully. "I get pulled into a meeting, told to align, maybe reassigned." "Fired?" "No," she said. "That would be messy. Messy. Everything here avoided mess." "What if I don't let them root around me?" I asked. Her brow furrowed. "You don't have that kind of authority." Not formally." She was quiet for a moment. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. "Really?" I thought about Rachel's voice on the phone, about families being scattered, about kids carrying backpacks out into the dark. "Because I already signed something that hurt people," I said, "and pretending I didn't won't undo it." Carol nodded slowly. "That's the trap," she said. "Once you see it, you can't go back. But going forward doesn't guarantee anything gets better." "I know," is his second. "You might lose," she said. "And nothing changes." "I know." She looked at me for a long time. "You're not wrong," she said finally. "You're just late." That stung more than I expected. "I know," I said. She sighed. "If you do this, don't do it alone." I wasn't planning to. She hesitated. "Then be careful who you trust." I left her desk feeling heavier than when I arrived, because I understood now that Carol wasn't the problem. She was the warning. She represented the version of myself I could become if I stayed quiet long enough, if I learned to justify small harms in service of smooth days. That frightened me more than any threat ever could. The system didn't need bad people. It needed tired ones, people who believed resistance was futile and therefore irresponsible. That night, I sat in my living room, lights off, listening to the refrigerator hum. I thought about how easy it would be to stop, to let someone else pick this up, to let time dull the edges of what I'd seen. No one would call me a coward. They'd call me realistic. But realism, I was starting to understand, was just another word for surrender when it wore a suit. And if I walked away now, Carol would be right. I wouldn't be wrong, just late. And that was a price I wasn't sure I could afford to keep paying. For weeks, I'd been carrying this like a personal reckoning. My name on the file, my signature at the bottom, my inbox filling with quiet reminders to stay in line. It felt intimate, accusatory, as if the system had singled me out and decided to see how far I'd bend. That belief was comforting in a strange way. If this was about me, then fixing it meant clearing my name, proving intent, correcting a mistake. But the truth didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, small enough to ignore if I wanted to. I didn't want to anymore. The first crack came from a spreadsheet I almost didn't open. It was an internal projection file, future permitting forecasts tied to redevelopment zones. I had access to it only because compliance occasionally had to cross-check timelines when inspectors were reassigned. I wasn't supposed to linger on it. I wasn't supposed to download it. I did both. The document covered 18 months forward, color-coded, clean, optimistic. What caught my eye wasn't North Carson. It was how insignificant North Carson was. A footnote, a completed step, one of dozens. I scrolled. Every address I'd been tracking, every expedited file, Every sudden closure appeared exactly once, each one marked not as an incident, but as a phase. Phase complete. Phase closed. Phase cleared. None of them were listed under risk. They were under preparation. That was the moment something fundamental shifted. I wasn't a target. I was a tool, not uniquely, not maliciously, just predictably. The system didn't care who signed the approvals, as long as someone did. My presence mattered only insofar as I reduced friction. If I burned out, transferred, or got reassigned, another name would slide into place. The machine wouldn't even stutter. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, feeling a weight lift and settle at the same time. Relief, because this wasn't personal. Horror, because that made it bigger. That night, I drove out to the edge of town, to a strip of road that overlooked a half-cleared construction site. Fencing sagged in places. Temporary lights cast harsh shadows across packed dirt. A banner hung crookedly on the gate, promising revitalization coming soon. I'd seen versions of it before. I sat in my truck and watched a lone security guard make his rounds, boots crunching on gravel. The land beneath him had already changed hands. The future was already decided. The people who'd passed through this place, the families, the kids, the nights spent waiting for something stable, had never been part of the plan. They were ballast, used to keep things steady until they weren't needed anymore. The next morning, I met Rachel in person for the first time. We chose a coffee shop near downtown that didn't belong to a chain, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that never quite got erased. She looked younger than I expected. Early 30s. Hair pulled back, dark circles under her eyes that no amount of caffeine could hide. We talked cautiously at first, about logistics, about placements, about the constant shuffle of people through spaces that were never meant to be homes. Then I showed her the map, not the spreadsheet, not the logs, just a simple overlay I'd printed the night before. Her organization's placement sites over the last year, marked in blue, redevelopment acquisitions over the same period, marked in red. The overlap was undeniable. She stared at it for a long time without speaking. They told us these were temporary gaps, she said finally. Places waiting for permits, waiting for funding. They were, I said, just not for what you thought. She looked up at me. You're saying we were used? Yes. She swallowed. We didn't know. I know. Does that matter? She asked. I didn't answer right away. Not to the system, I said eventually. But it should matter to us. She folded the paper carefully, like it might cut her if she handled it roughly. So what happens now? She asked. That was the question everyone kept circling. What happens if you do nothing? She continued. Do they keep using us? Yes. And if you do something? She asked. I thought of Carol, of Dan, of the HR meeting. Then I stopped being useful, I said. Rachel studied me. And is that the worst thing? I laughed once, quietly. In my world, it's up there. We sat in silence for a moment. This isn't about your job, she said slowly. Is it? No, I said. It never was. It was about scale, about how many people could be moved, displaced, forgotten, as long as the paperwork stayed clean, about how easy it was to mistake legality for morality when the harm was distributed thin enough. On my way back to the office, my phone buzzed. A message from Operations Coordination. Needs status update on the Harborview file. Another one, different address, same playbook. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened the file and scrolled through it carefully. Same signs, same temporary occupancy language, same unresolved violations cleared by a third-party inspection. The families hadn't been placed yet. There was still time. For the first time since this began, the choice in front of me wasn't about correcting the past. It was about interrupting the future. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair. If I blocked this, it wouldn't stop the system. It would route around me. But routing around me would leave a mark. A delay, a question, a trace. Systems hate traces. At 3:14 p.m., I flagged the file for mandatory cross-department review. Not as a protest, not as an accusation, as a procedure. At 3:16, my phone rang. Dan, why did you flag Harborview? He asked. Because it doesn't meet compliance, I said. We don't have time for this, he replied. I know, I said. That's why it works. Silence. You're making this about you, he said. I looked at the file on my screen. No, I said. I'm making it about what happens after. The line went dead. I sat there, heart steady, hands still. This wasn't heroism. It wasn't even defiance. It was refusal. Refusal to pretend my role was smaller than it was. Refusal to believe that being replaceable meant being irrelevant. The truth was simple and unbearable at the same time. This system didn't need my silence to survive, but it needed my participation to stay invisible. And once I understood that, there was no version of myself that could go back to believing this was just about a file, or a mistake, or a man who signed the wrong paper on a Tuesday. It had never been about me. It was about who the system was built to protect, and who it was designed to move out of the way. The week after I flagged Harborview was the quietest week I'd had in years. No emails marked urgent. No late-night archive activity. No polite reminders to move things along. It would have been easy to mistake that silence for resolution. Instead, it felt like the air pressure dropping before a storm. I started noticing how often people avoided my eyes. Not dramatically. Not in a way you could complain about. Just small adjustments, conversations ending when I walked up, emails that used to include me now routed around me, meetings where my input wasn't requested. I hadn't been reprimanded. I hadn't been warned. I had been sidelined. And that was when the alternative revealed itself. Because being sidelined wasn't punishment. It was an offer. I could feel it in the way Dan spoke to me when he finally stopped by my desk that Thursday afternoon. His tone was lighter than I expected, almost friendly. "Things seem calmer," he said. "They do," I replied. He nodded. "That's good for everyone." He leaned against the edge of my desk, lowering his voice slightly. "Look," he said, "you've made your point." I didn't respond. "And the system adjusted," he continued. "Which means no one's mad. No one's looking to make an example out of you." I waited. "You can let this settle," he said. "Focus on your regular workload. Let other departments handle the rest." "Yes. And Harborview?" I asked. He hesitated. "Just a fraction. It'll move," he said. "With or without you." There it was. The truth, finally stated plainly. I looked at my screen, at the queue of routine files waiting for review. Clean, boring, safe. This was the exit ramp. I could step back into my lane, keep my head down, and let the system do what it was designed to do. No one would call me complicit. No one would call me a coward. They'd say I tried. They'd say I raised concerns. They'd say it wasn't my fight. Dan straightened up. "Take the win," he said softly. "Most people don't even get that." After he walked away, I sat there for a long time. I thought about my life outside this building. My mortgage was manageable, but only because my salary was steady. My health insurance came through work. My retirement account wasn't impressive, but it existed. I didn't have a partner to fall back on. No family in town, no safety net that didn't have a payroll department attached to it. Walking away wouldn't be dramatic. It would be practical. That afternoon, Rachel texted me. "Any updates?" I stared at the message without replying, because the honest answer was yes. The update was that I could stop, and stopping would be easy. That night, I sat on my back patio with a beer I didn't really want, watching the sun sink behind the hills. The air smelled like dust and cut grass. Somewhere, a neighbor laughed. I tried to imagine my life a year from now if I did nothing. Same house, same job, same routines. I tried to imagine Harborview. Families moved in, families moved out. Another banner promising revitalization. Another development press release talking about community investment. I told myself I wasn't responsible for the world, just my corner of it. And in that moment, the argument almost worked. Almost. Then my phone buzzed again. Another message from Rachel. "They're asking us to place 3 families there tomorrow night." Tomorrow? My chest tightened. "Do they know it's unresolved?" I typed. "They say the city cleared it," she replied. I closed my eyes. Tomorrow meant there was still time, but only if someone used it. I opened my laptop and logged into the system from home. Harborview sat in my queue, flagged but untouched. No new documentation, no updates, no resolution, just waiting. The choice wasn't abstract anymore. It had a deadline. I could walk away now and nothing would happen to me. That was the truth. No one would fire me. No one would blacklist me. I'd fade back into the machinery, another gear spinning quietly. The families would move in. The system would proceed. And the harm would be spread thin enough that no one could point to a single cause. I thought about Carol's words. You're just late. I thought about Luis, about failing a site and being told to let it go. I thought about the missing staple. How easy it had been to ignore. That was the real test. Not whether I was willing to risk something dramatic, but whether I was willing to accept a clean conscience bought at someone else's expense. I picked up my phone and typed a message to Rachel. Don't place anyone there yet. 3 dots appeared. Why? I hesitated. Because once I sent the next message, there would be no pretending this was theoretical. Because it's not safe, I wrote. And because I'm not done. Her reply came almost immediately. Okay, we'll hold. I set the phone down and felt my hands start to shake. Not with fear, with clarity. I wasn't choosing between heroism and cowardice. I was choosing between convenience and responsibility. The system had offered me a way out that didn't look like surrender. That was the most dangerous part. I closed the laptop and went inside, heart pounding now, not from panic, but from resolve. Tomorrow, Harborview would move again, with or without me. The difference was that now I had decided which side of that sentence I was on. And for the first time since this began, I understood the cost clearly. Not just what I might lose, but what I would be choosing to live with if I didn't act. I went to bed knowing sleep would be hard, but also knowing something else, just as surely. Walking away would have been easier. It also would have been the last decision I ever made for myself. I didn't confront anyone. That was the first decision. No dramatic emails. No slammed doors. No accusations that could be waved away as emotional or unprofessional. If I had learned anything by now, it was this. The system was built to absorb noise. It wasn't built to handle friction that looked like compliance. So I did what the system respected most. I followed the rules. Exactly. At 6:18 a.m. the next morning, I was already at my desk. Before operations logged in, before Dan arrived, before the rhythm of the day could drown out small, inconvenient details, I opened Harborview again. This time, I didn't read it like an inspector. I read it like an auditor. Every line, every reference, every cross-departmental dependency. The violations were subtle, but they were real. A fire egress calculation that assumed a lower occupancy than what the placement required. An electrical load report that rounded down instead of up. A temporary partition classified as non-structural without documentation. Individually, each one could be debated. Together, they failed. I didn't reject the file. I escalated it. Not upward, sideways. I routed it to mandatory interdepartmental review, a process that existed mostly on paper and was rarely used because it was slow, painfully slow. It required sign-off from 3 departments that didn't like talking to each other: compliance, fire, and risk management. I added no commentary, no editorializing, just a note citing the exact code sections that required review. By 6:32 a.m., the file was locked. No one could move it without leaving a visible trail. At 7:04, my phone buzzed. Operations coordination. Why is Harborview locked? I didn't respond. At 7:19, another message. We need to discuss this. Still nothing. At 7:41, Dan appeared at my desk. His face was calm. Too calm. You can't do this, he said quietly. I already did, I replied. He glanced around, then leaned in. You're triggering a process that isn't meant for this. It's meant for exactly this, I said. It's just inconvenient. He straightened. You're forcing people into meetings. Yes. You're slowing things down. Yes. He stared at me for a long moment. Do you know what happens when you slow things down at this level? I know what happens when we don't, I said. He exhaled sharply and walked away. By mid-morning, the ripple effect had begun. Emails pinged across departments. Calendar invites appeared. People who hadn't spoken in months were suddenly required to. Questions were asked that no one liked answering. Why was this approved as temporary occupancy without full remediation? Who cleared the third-party inspection? Why were previous unresolved violations not referenced? Each question was reasonable. Together, they were corrosive. At Elva, Shugo 6 a.m. Fire flagged the electrical load report. At 12:03, Risk Management requested clarification on occupancy assumptions. By 1:15, the file had transformed. Not rejected, not approved, contested. That word mattered. Contested files don't disappear quietly. They require documentation, accountability, follow-through. At 1:42 p.m., I received an email from HR. Please stop by before end of day. I closed it and went back to work. I didn't need to guess what the meeting would be about. But I also knew something else. They couldn't punish me for following procedure. That was the shield. At tray 0 p.m., Rachel texted. Placement delayed. They're saying paperwork issue. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Good, I replied. Keep it that way. Her response came a minute later. How? I thought for a moment, then typed. By making silence expensive, the HR meeting was exactly what I expected. Polite, vague, concerned. They talked about workflow disruptions and interdepartmental strain, about the importance of collaboration. I listened, nodded, took notes. When they asked why I escalated Harborview, I answered simply, because it didn't meet compliance. They asked if I'd discussed it with my supervisor. I did, I said. He disagreed. They asked if I understood the broader implications. I understand the code, I replied. There was nothing they could write down that sounded like insubordination, so they let me go with a warning. Not formal, just noted. That evening, I stayed late again, not to watch, to prepare. I knew Harborview was only one site. If I wanted this to matter, I couldn't chase files one by one. That would burn me out and change nothing. I needed leverage, not power. Leverage. I requested a process review. That was the second decision. Process reviews were dry, bureaucratic, usually initiated after lawsuits or audits. They didn't accuse anyone. They examined how work moved, where decisions bottlenecked, where risk accumulated. I framed the request carefully. Concerns about inconsistent handling of temporary occupancy approvals, potential exposure due to unclear interdepartmental boundaries, recommendation for review to ensure procedural integrity, language that made executives nervous without making them defensive. The request was approved 2 days later. That surprised me. Then I realized why. Process reviews protect the institution. They give leadership cover. If something went wrong later, they could say they'd examined it. That meant they'd allow it. What they didn't realize, what they couldn't control, was what the review would uncover once it started asking the wrong questions. The review required data. I already had it. When the request for documentation came down, I provided everything. Logs, timelines, examples, not accusations, patterns. I let the data speak. Meanwhile, Harborview stayed locked. The developer pushed. Operations nudged. Dan stopped speaking to me altogether. None of that mattered, because the review had begun, and reviews don't move fast. They move visibly. At the end of that week, I received one last message from Operations Coordination. You're making things difficult. I stared at the words for a long time. Then I typed back. I'm making them documented. I didn't know how this would end. I didn't know if the review would be neutered, redirected, or quietly shelved. But I knew something had changed. For the first time, the system couldn't pretend this was invisible. It couldn't rely on individual compliance to keep the machine smooth. I hadn't exposed anyone. I hadn't gone public. I hadn't raised my voice. I had simply removed the lubricant, and machines don't like friction. They either grind to a halt, or they reveal what they're made of. The review didn't explode anything. There were no headlines, no raids, no dramatic resignations announced in a flurry of press releases. What it did instead was spread, slowly, quietly, like a stain you don't notice until you try to clean around it and realize it's everywhere. The first change came disguised as a clarification, an email from the city manager's office, sent to all departments, outlining temporary adjustments to how expedited compliance approvals would be handled going forward. More documentation required. Clearer chains of accountability. Mandatory cross-checks when occupancy was involved. Nothing accusatory, just heavier. The second change was procedural. Operations coordination lost direct routing authority on compliance files involving residential use. The language was careful to reduce bottlenecks, to improve transparency. The woman with the discreet smile didn't lose her job. She was reassigned. Special projects, which was where people went when they were too visible to ignore and too inconvenient to fire. Harborview never reopened. The developer pulled out quietly, citing unexpected regulatory delays. The property went back on the market 6 months later, listed at a lower price. No families moved in. No families were kicked out. That should have felt like a win. It didn't, because while Harborview stalled, other projects adjusted. Developers got smarter, more patient. They stopped relying on temporary occupancy. They found other ways to hold land without drawing attention. The system adapted. It always does. At work, my days changed shape. Not in any official way. My title stayed the same. My paycheck arrived on schedule. No one disciplined me. But the texture of my work shifted. I was no longer asked to weigh in on borderline cases. My name stopped appearing on pilot projects or interdepartmental initiatives. When meetings were scheduled, I received the minutes afterward. I wasn't punished. I was excluded. Carol stopped coming by my desk. When we passed in the hallway, she nodded politely, like we'd once worked together, but no longer did. I didn't blame her. Staying close to me now would have cost her. Dan avoided me entirely. When he had to speak to me, it was clipped, professional, distant. He had been careful, never to cross a line that could be documented. He was good at his job. So was I. That was the problem. The process review concluded 3 months later. Its findings were thorough, inconsistent oversight, ambiguous responsibility, recommendations for clearer boundaries and enhanced safeguards. It didn't name harm. It didn't name victims. It named risk. Leadership thanked everyone involved for their cooperation. No one mentioned me. Rachel's organization received a new set of placement guidelines shortly after. Stricter requirements, more site visits, fewer temporary solutions. She told me it would help in the long run. She also told me it would mean turning more people away in the short term. There were no perfect outcomes, only trade-offs. One afternoon, several weeks after the review wrapped, I found an envelope on my desk. No return address. Inside was a single typed page. You made things harder for a lot of people. That was it. No signature. No threat. Just a statement. I folded the page carefully and slipped it into my bag. At home that night, I took it out again and read it under the kitchen light. It wasn't wrong. I had made things harder. For operations. For my supervisor. For developers who now had to wait longer. For departments that now had to document decisions they used to slide through. I had also made things harder for myself. My career would likely plateau here. I wasn't going to be promoted. I wasn't going to be tapped for leadership roles or invited into rooms where policy was shaped. I had become friction, useful only up to a point. And yet, there was something else. Rachel called me one evening to tell me about a family she'd placed in a permanent unit after weeks of waiting. It took longer, she said, but it stuck. I pictured the delay, the paperwork, the extra scrutiny. That's good, I said. It is, she agreed, but I won't pretend it was easy. I thought about the message in my bag. You made things harder. Yes, I thought. That was the point. There were days I wondered if I should have gone further. Gone public. Burned it down. Forced accountability through exposure instead of erosion. But then I'd remember how the system reacted to noise. How it absorbed outrage and punished instability. What I had done wasn't heroic. It was strategic. And strategy doesn't feel like victory when you're inside it. One Friday afternoon, I ran into Carol in the parking garage. She looked tired. Older than she had a year ago. Still here? She asked. Still here, I replied. She hesitated. Do you regret it? I considered the question carefully. No, I said, but I don't enjoy it. She nodded. That sounds about right. She paused, then added, some things did change, more than they'll admit. I know, I said, just not enough to feel good about. She finished. We stood there for a moment, engines idling around us, then went our separate ways. That night, I sat alone on my patio again, listening to the familiar sounds of the neighborhood settling into sleep. Nothing dramatic had happened. No one had thanked me. No one had apologized. The people who benefited would never know my name. The people who were inconvenienced would never forget it. That was the cost, not of doing the wrong thing, but of doing the right thing quietly. I thought back to the day I could have walked away. How easy it would have been to accept the offer of silence, disguised as peace. I understood now why so many people took it. It wasn't cowardice. It was fatigue. The system didn't crush you. It waited you out. I finished my drink and went inside, setting the glass in the sink. Tomorrow, I'd go back to work, review files, follow procedures, make small decisions that would never be noticed unless they went wrong. I hadn't changed the world. I hadn't even changed the city. But somewhere in the machinery, there were now extra steps, extra questions, extra delays, and in a system that thrived on speed and silence, that was not nothing. No one celebrated that, but I could live with it. And in the end, that was the only measure that mattered. People like to imagine moments like this ending with clarity, a clean line drawn, a lesson learned, a version of yourself you can point to and say, that's when I became someone else. It doesn't work that way. Nothing about my life changed all at once. There was no single morning where I woke up lighter or prouder, or sure that I'd done the right thing in some grand, unmistakable sense. What changed was quieter, subtle enough that if I hadn't been paying attention, I might have missed it. The system didn't collapse. It didn't apologize. It didn't even admit it had been wrong. It adjusted, and then it moved on. So did everyone else. A few months after the review closed, a new hire joined our floor, younger, sharp, eager in the way people are before they learn which questions slow things down. I watched him work from across the room, recognizing the habits I used to have, the efficiency, the confidence, the unexamined trust in process. One afternoon, I saw him pause over a file. He frowned, checked something twice, looked up, scanning for guidance. For a brief moment, our eyes met. He didn't ask me anything. He made a decision and moved on. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or disappointed. I stopped trying to measure my impact and outcomes. That had been my mistake early on, thinking that if I couldn't point to a victory, I must have failed. That change had to be loud to be real. But systems like the one I worked in didn't respond to sound. They responded to weight. Friction added slowly. Expectations shifted quietly. Shortcuts made less reliable. That was all I'd ever really been able to do. There were days I resented that. Days I imagined what it would have felt like to blow it all open, to hand everything to a reporter, to see names in print and faces on screens. But those fantasies never lasted long. I knew what would have followed. An investigation framed as overreach. A narrative about a disgruntled employee. A system temporarily embarrassed, then reinforced. I hadn't wanted to be right. I'd wanted the harm to stop, even partially, even imperfectly. Rachel and I stopped talking regularly, not because of anything that happened between us, but because the crisis that had brought us together had passed. Her work continued. So did mine. Every now and then, she'd send a brief update. A family moved into something permanent. A site was rejected early this time. No exclamation points. No gratitude that made me uncomfortable. Just information. I never asked if it was because of what I'd done. It didn't matter. At work, I settled into a rhythm that felt different from before. I took longer with files, not because I was afraid, because I was deliberate. I documented everything, not defensively, methodically. I didn't seek out battles, but I didn't avoid them either. When something didn't meet compliance, I said so. When it did, I signed it and moved on. The difference was that I no longer believed that neutrality meant innocence. That belief had been comforting once. Now it felt naive. One evening, as I was locking up my office, I caught my reflection in the glass door. Same face, same posture, same tired lines around the eyes. I didn't look like someone who'd stood up to a system. I looked like someone who'd learned how systems actually worked. And that, I realized, was the point. Heroes are useful in stories because they make complexity manageable. They give you someone to cheer for, someone to blame, someone to follow. But real systems don't fear heroes. They wait them out. What they fear, if fear is the right word, are people who don't need to be seen. People who aren't looking for redemption or recognition. People who don't confuse visibility with effectiveness. I didn't become a whistleblower. I didn't become a leader. I didn't become a martyr. I became harder to move. That was all. And it was enough. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, months later, I drove past the old North Carson property without meaning to. The building stood empty now, windows dark, the fence leaning slightly where someone had cut through and patched it poorly. The banner was gone. No promise of revitalization. Just silence. I pulled over for a moment and sat there, engine idling, watching dust drift across the lot. I thought about the families who'd been there briefly, about how close they'd come to being just another line item in a projection spreadsheet. I thought about how easy it would have been to never know their names, to never feel responsible. The responsibility hadn't made me noble. It had made me careful. Careful about what I signed. Careful about what I ignored. Careful about the stories I told myself to justify comfort. I drove away without ceremony. No closure. No lesson neatly wrapped. Just the quiet understanding that the world hadn't been fixed and never would be by one person, but that a small part of it had been made less efficient at causing harm. And that mattered. Not enough to celebrate. Enough to live with. That was the ending I got. Not a victory. Not a transformation. Just the ability to look at my work, my reflection, my choices, and know that when I had the chance to disappear quietly, I didn't. I stayed. And sometimes, in systems designed to move people along without noticing them, staying is the most disruptive thing you can do.